Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and God's blessing be with you. It's an honour to be able to speak on the subject of the preservation of the Bible and the Qur'an. When Christians and Muslims discuss ideas, they often quote from their holy books, the Bible for the Christians and the Qur'an and Hadith for the Muslim. When we are having these discussions, there are often two assumptions that the Muslim has. The first is that the Qur'an is perfect. Let me quote from some Islamic teachers. The Qur'an was memorised by Muhammad and then dictated to his companions and written down by scribes who cross-checked it during his lifetime. Not one word of its 114 chapters have ever been changed over the centuries. Or again, no other book in the world can match the Qur'an. The astonishing fact about the Book of Allah is that it has remained unchanged even to a dot over the last 1400 years. No variation of text can be found in it. But when it comes to the Bible, there's a different assumption that is there. Again, let me quote from an Islamic teacher. The books that are in the hands of the people of the book, the Christians and Jews today, should not be viewed as authentic because they have been distorted, altered and tampered with. These are the assumptions that many Muslims have when discussing matters with Christians. Now, it matters for three reasons, this. Firstly, it actually stops discussion. Because a Christian may quote something from one of the prophets, but the Muslim easily just dismisses it because they had this assumption. It's also important, secondly, because Muslims will say that they believe all the prophets. And yet from the Christian perspective, in practice, what we see Muslims doing is not reading those prophets. And so it doesn't seem that they really believe them. And thirdly, it matters because it's how we determine what the message of the prophets are. And we want to know what the message of the prophets are. And so for one group to be saying your book's corrupted and the other not, it affects how we come to that decision. So tonight, we're discussing a very important issue, and I want to begin with the preservation of the Qur'an. Now, Islam is based on the Qur'an and the Hadith, but tonight I'm just considering the Qur'an and its preservation. The preservation of the Hadith would be an important issue, but we won't do that tonight. Now, regarding the preservation of the Qur'an, we're told that it was a matter of simple dictation, and then it was perfectly memorised and preserved by Muhammad's followers. But there's actually more to it than this. I want to read us from a hadith here from Imam Bukhari, and I'll be quoting from these types of sources tonight. Narrated by Al-Bara, there was revealed, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So from Surah 4, verse 95. The Prophet said, call Zayd for me and let him bring the board and the ink pot and the scapular bone, that is the writing equipment. Then he said, right, not equal are those believers who sit and to those who sit. And at that time, Amir bin Maktam, the blind man, was sitting beside the Prophet. He said, O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me as regard the above verses? I'm a blind man. So instead of the above verse, the following verse was revealed. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled by an injury or blind or lame, and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So we see that there was the first version of the verse, Surah 4, verse 95, and then a later, we could even say an improved version to cover other situations. Now this type of changing of what Muhammad recited happened so often that it made the Meccans comment about it and were critical of him, and it actually evoked a response in the Qur'an itself. And so we read here, and when we exchange a verse in place of another, and God knows very well what he is sending down, they say to Muhammad, thou art a mere forger. So you can see how this issue of changing what he was saying actually was noticed by those around him, and a verse needed to be revealed. He needed to say a verse to cover this. This shows that the Qur'an was fluid during Muhammad's lifetime, and its preservation was not simply dictation and memorisation, as certain parts were revised. My next point is that Muhammad never collected the Qur'an into one volume, and this caused preservation problems. Let me just read to you from the Hadith again, narrated by Zayd bin Thabit. I suggest you, O Abu Bakr, order that the Qur'an be collected. I said to Umar, how can you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? See, Muhammad never compiled the Qur'an into a final volume. It was his companions who collected the Qur'an into one book, but they had memorised the Qur'an differently. Again, consider this hadith, narrated by Ibrahim. The companions of Abdullah ibn Masud came to Abu Darda, and before they arrived at his home, he looked for them and found them. Then he asked, "Who among you can recite the Qur'an as Abdullah recites it?" They replied, "All of us." He asked, "Who among you knows it by heart?" They pointed at Alqama. And he asked Alqama, "How did you hear Abdullah ibn Masud reciting Surat Al-Layl?" Alqama recited, "By the male and the female." That's a certain verse from the Qur'an. Abu Adar said, "I testify that I heard the Prophet reciting it likewise, but these people," this is in Iraq, "want me to recite it by him who created male and female, and by Allah I will not follow them." You see, Muhammad's companions did preserve the Qur'an by memorising it, but the hadith itself testifies to it being memorised differently. These different versions of the Qur'an began to cause trouble among the Islamic community, and so the third Caliph Uthman solved this problem by burning all of these other versions and making one standard version. We read, "Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what he had copied and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscript or copies, be burnt." Now, most of the companions did receive and accept Muhammad's standard version of the Qur'an. However, not all of them did. And so again we meet Abdullah ibn Masud again. And it says here in the Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Masud reported that he said to his companions to conceal their copies of the Qur'an. And so they didn't give them up for burning. Now, the differences between these different versions of the Qur'an was a subject of many of the early scholars of Islam in the classical period. A particular librarian named Abi Yaqub al-Nadim was a librarian who made a catalogue of the Arabic books in the year 377 AH or 987 AD. And in doing so, he actually goes around and collects Qur'ans from different locations, and he gives different lists of the different surahs that were in them. And he notices that the surahs are in different order and sometimes have extra surahs or fewer surahs. In fact, he makes an entry in his catalogue on this, and the title of the entry is the books composed about the discrepancies in the Quranic manuscripts. And it goes through all these different main capital cities of the Islamic Empire, and there were 7 books that he lists in his catalogue recording these. When these Islamic scholars are quoted either directly or from later people who use them, we see that they say about these early versions of the Qur'an that the number of surahs varied between 110 and 111. The order of the surahs were different. Sometimes the verses had different number of words or words in different orders. And they also had a different attitude to the Bismillah and whether or not it was part of the Qur'an. Therefore, historically, the preservation of the Qur'an is not as many Islamic leaders tell us. There were different memorised versions of the Qur'an with different canons of surahs, different numbers, and a standard version was made and the others were burnt. I'd now like to look at the current situation with the Qur'an. As I quoted before, Christians are often told that the Qur'ans around the world are absolutely identical. However, this is not the case. There are different versions or readings in the Arabic qira'at of the Qur'an used around the world. These qira'at are famous recordings of how 10 famous men recited the Qur'an. If you actually want to read the Qur'an, you have to read it according to one of these famous reciters. The most popular one is the one standardised by the Islamic Empire, and that is by Imam Hafs. And so this is the one that is used in the majority of the Islamic world. But Warsh, according to the Qur'an, according to Imam Warsh, is the Arabic Qur'an used in most of North Africa. And Imam Khaldun's version is in Algeria. And Al-Juri is in the Sudan. But as I said, there are 10 accepted versions. It's often said by Islamic leaders that these different versions are only different in terms of accent. But this is actually not the case. If we just consider chapter 21, verse 4, the top Arabic there is from Warsh. And I'll see how my Arabic goes. It's Kul, Rabi, Yai, Lamu. Something like that, forgive me. And that means, say, my Lord knows. And so in the Warsh transmission, it's God saying say, which is a phrase that is often in the Qur'an. But in the Hafs transmission, it says, Kala Rabbi Ya'lamu, which is he said, my Lord knows. This may seem like a small change, but it changes the subject of the sentence from God to Muhammad. There are actually 10 of these versions, as I said before, and there are Qur'ans you can get, they're not easy to get, which have the variants of all the 10 listed in the margins. And there are over 4,000 differences between these authorised versions. Another difference between these Qur'ans is the Bismillah. This is the introduction that you read at the beginning of the surahs of the Qur'an, saying, in the name of Allah the Merciful and the Compassionate. Now, it's interesting that amongst these 10 authorised versions, they don't all accept the Bismillah as actually part of the Qur'an. And so we read here in this Islamic scholar saying, the readers themselves differ over whether the Bismillah was a verse in Surah Fatiha and the other surahs. Among the readers, Ibn Kathir, Azim and Al-Kazi were the only ones who considered it to be a verse at the beginning of each surah, whereas the others did not. And so the exact knowledge about the Bismillah and whether or not it's actually part of the Qur'an has not been preserved. Now, the majority of Muslims in practice in the world following the Hafs transmission take this as the first part of the verse of each surah, except Surah 9. But with the Warsh transmission, and actually the majority of the readers, it is just like one of the titles that is put there. It's actually just what is said as a way of introducing it, but not part of the Qur'an itself. Therefore, there are actually differences between the modern Qur'ans in various ways. We've also got the ancient manuscripts that we can look at, the manuscripts from the Samarkand manuscript, the new recent discoveries in Sana'a in Yemen, the Bankipur Codex, and the Topapi manuscript in Egypt. Some of these claim to be written by Uthman, others not. But amongst all of them, there are variants to what is in the modern Qur'an today. And so it is just not true when Islamic leaders say that what they say about the Qur'an, in that it is perfect and free from any variation and has just come simply to us. But I'm not going to exaggerate it either. I do not believe that the Qur'an is totally corrupt. I'm not trying to say that. The differences do not change the overall meaning of the Qur'an, and it seems to be a credible record of what Muhammad recited. What I am asking for, though, is that people, that Islamic leaders in particular, stop exaggerating this point. The next point I want to move on to is the Bible. Now, the Bible is a collection of 66 books from around 40 different prophets. It's not just from one time, from the time of Jesus, but it's from the time of Moses right through to Jesus and his disciples over about a 1,500-year period. And in the case of each of these books, each of these individual books have their own history as to how they were preserved. So the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, begin with Moses himself receiving the law from God, speaking with God face to face, receiving the 10 Commandments on the mountain. But we also see, as we read the later books of Joshua and 1 Samuel, that other prophets were also involved in the preservation and addition to the books of Moses. And so the books of Moses become a work of a number of prophets according to the Bible. The Psalms of David were also used in the temple and preserved within that area. There were prophets like Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah and Daniel who we read in the Bible. And often we're told about their scribe who was with them, or that they had a school of prophets with them. And these people were responsible for keeping the words that they said preserved. After the exile for Israel, that was a time when Israel was banished from the land and suffered greatly. And it was when they start to come back that they begin, it seems, to gather all of these books together, these different scrolls that they have. And we have a reference to Nehemiah collecting these books together. When we want to have a list of exactly what these books are, we can't find really any early list. We certainly get references to the fact that they had scriptures, but to get a complete list, we've really got to wait to the period of the early centuries of the Christian era. And just as the early Muslims had to discuss the canon of what was in the Qur'an and which surahs were in and which weren't, it was the same with the Bible as well, with the Old Testament. When we consider the Gospel, now moving to the New Testament, we see that Jesus sent his apostles to the nations, And we actually know this. They were his students and they preserved his teachings. The apostles of Jesus actually did miracles as Jesus did, and they were the living witness to Jesus. They were prophets themselves. They told the story of Jesus and established an oral tradition. We read in 2 Peter 1:15 that Peter himself was making preparations so that the things he had said would be preserved. And so from a historical point of view, the church had this oral tradition, and then this oral tradition was placed into the writing of the Gospels, probably with the death of the apostles. The letters that we also find in the New Testament are letters actually written by the apostles themselves. They're different to the Gospels, which record Jesus' life. These are written from the apostles as authoritative statements to the churches. Now, these letters themselves, they were often written to large areas. So at the beginning of 1 Peter, we read that he sent his letter to all of modern-day Turkey. And in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, we read how Paul commands the church to make a copy of the letter he sent them and to send it on to another church. And it was through this process that these letters were passed around and distributed amongst the churches. But in time, it became necessary to finalise and to make a clear statement as to what these actual documents were. There were people like Marcion who were saying he didn't accept the Gospels, and he didn't accept any of the prophets who were before Jesus, and he only accepted certain things. There was also the question of Christians doing mission to other cultures, and they wanted to know which books do we translate. There was also persecution by Roman emperors, and so you wanted to know which books you had to protect. There were false gospels that were written. There were false letters in the apostles' names that were written. But there were also good letters that had been written by Christian leaders as well. So there were many good letters like the Epistle of Barnabas and other documents which weren't wrong, but yet they weren't apostolic. And so the church leaders, in various discussions, very often at an informal level, they certainly didn't have a council just on this subject, began to publish lists in the 2nd, 3rd to the 6th century to state which books were genuine. Now, this was not a straightforward process. It required work and discussion to work these matters out. They were looking at matters like, could it be proven that it was written by one of the apostles? Was there a chain of testimony going back from one disciple to another disciple back to the apostle? A chain of narration back to say that this was a genuine letter from them, or a genuine gospel. Did it conform, the second point was, did it conform to the rule of faith? And that is, did it agree with what the Old Testament prophets had said? And had the document a history of being continuously used in the church at large? Again, I don't want to exaggerate this because we can exaggerate it both ways. Sometimes Christians can say that it was just a seamless process, that the whole thing was nice and simple. It wasn't that simple. But neither should we exaggerate it, because in the end, I think they only discussed about 15% of the New Testament. Most of it just wasn't even discussed, but there was 15%, and that needs to be said. I just thought I'd give you a quick example of one of them from the Gospel of Thomas. This is often quoted today, and you can see why the church left it. In fact, there are similar types of quotes in all the Gospels. So we read here, it says here, Simon Peter says to them, "Let Mary go out from our midst, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "See, I will draw her so as to make her male, so that she also may become a living spirit like you males. For every woman who has become a male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, that is so far from what the gospel teaches about it doesn't matter if you're a male or a female, you can be saved. And it's so far from the Old Testament, which says that God made male and female in his image. And so when we look at these other gospels, you can actually see why they didn't preserve them and include them. Another point I want to look at is who had control over the Bible. Now, this matters because you need to have control over something in order to change it. But the New Testament in particular has never been in one set of hands. Most people think that the Roman Catholic Church holds all power in Christianity and that it can do what it's like, but this is not the case. It is a major section of the Christian church, but there's also the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Egyptian Church, the Ethiopian Church, each with its own government. Some people think that Emperor Constantine changed it, but this is historically not true. He didn't even control all of the regions of Christianity, and he didn't make those types of direct changes on the church anyway. No one group has had control over the Bible to change it on any global scale. Any changes that did occur happened at a local level and not global. We've also got the traditions of the church that we can consider. If we assume for a moment that the New Testament was a book that was being added and subtracted to, then what type of additions and subtractions would you expect? I think it's reasonable to say that the changes would be ones that support the church's teaching. But consider the following. When we go through the New Testament, we don't see the word Trinity in there, even though that was a very popular word. It wasn't just added in. Or in the early church, the use of icons, the use of images in worship became normal practice. Yet the Bible never says to do that, and we never have that type of thing happening. In fact, the book of Acts records the Apostle Paul put the image makers out of business. And if we consider Mary, we see that by that time, in the early years of the church, only after a few hundred years, Mary starts to be worshipped as the Queen of Heaven, that she remains a virgin forever and that you can pray to her. Yet in Luke 11:27, Jesus says that you can be more blessed than Mary if you obey God's word. Now, why wasn't that changed? Because it's saying that any Christian believer can be more blessed by obeying the word of God. The types of changes that we would expect if the Bible was an open book are not present. We also, of course, have many thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament going back in fragments to the early centuries. Now, there are small differences between these. They're not all absolutely identical. But because we have different manuscripts from different regions, when we do see a difference, we can look and we see a difference in one region, we can compare it to other regions, and if the other regions don't have that difference, we can just deduct and say, well, that's an error that's crept in. Maybe someone's made a mistake, a deliberate or unintentional one. But these manuscripts that we have, and the mainline scholars will say, show that the New Testament has been well preserved. It's also, I think, fair to say that the preservation of the Bible is seen in the coherence of all the prophets being together. Because throughout all the Bible, we have the sacrifice for sin being spoken about through Moses, through Isaiah, through all the prophets, finding its fulfillment in Jesus. Again, we have God with us in the garden, God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden, and God walking with us in Jesus. We have the image of God being there in the book of Moses, in the Psalms, in prophets like David, and in the Gospel. And the doctrine of the Son of God for the Messiah and God's people being through all the prophets. But there's one more point I'd like to point out for Muslims to consider, and that is the Qur'an's attitude to the Bible. In Surah 384, we read this. We believe in Allah and in what has been revealed to us and what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob and the tribes, and in the books given to Moses, Jesus and the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between one another among them. Now, often when Muslims look at this, they say, yeah, that was the scriptures of Moses and Jesus, but not of what Christians have today. Yet if you read there, when it talks about these books, it makes it clear. It says, those who follow the messenger Muhammad, the prophet who can neither read nor write, whom they will find described in the Torah and the Gospel, which are with them. So it's speaking about the books that were actually with the Christians and the Jews at that time. In fact, in Surah 10, verse 49, Muhammad himself is commanded to read these scriptures if he's in doubt. We see that Muhammad actually respected these scriptures. We see here it says, narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar, a group of Jews came and invited the apostle of Allah, peace be upon him, to Kuf. So he visited them in the school. They placed a cushion for the apostle of Allah, peace be upon him, who sat on it and said, bring the Torah. When it was then brought, then he withdrew the cushion from beneath him and placed the Torah on it, saying, I believe in thee and in him who revealed thee. You see, that is Muhammad making no distinction. There are actually verses in the Qur'an saying that unbelieving Jews and Christians mistreated the scriptures. But this does not mean that the faithful Christians did and lost it. In fact, there are similar verses about the Qur'an being torn to pieces and people selling it for profit. And so similar types of statements that are made about unfaithful Christians are also made about unfaithful Muslims. So to conclude, I ask Islamic leaders not to exaggerate on these points. Both the Bible and the Qur'an have had a process of being collected and have small variants within them, but yet they are well preserved when we look at the evidence. And I'd like to finish by talking about my own experience. When I believed the gospel and became a Christian, I started to read and love the earlier prophets that were before Jesus in the Old Testament, even though some of them were hard to understand. But when I've seen people become Muslim, they've actually turned away from those prophets, and they now only listen to what Muhammad says. Who turns people away from the prophets? Is it God or Satan? God turns people to his prophets so that they can turn and have life. And that's what I pray that all of us will do here today, that we'll believe the prophets and read them on their own. And so I invite you today to read the prophets, to read the Bible and find out what the prophets said. There are cards, and you can read it also on my website. Thank you.
I'll start by seeking refuge in God from the curse of Satan, and I'll welcome all the Muslims here with Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I'll welcome all the Christians as well that are here, and thank the organisers for hosting this event with a hearty welcome, and I genuinely hope that at least so far there's been something interesting for you, and hopefully I'll be able to follow that along, and that may be the continuing theme of the evening. So I'm going to be talking about, first of all, what we say about the Qur'an, and then what the evidence says about the Qur'an. I think we've kind of probably started our presentation somewhat similarly, and then secondly I'll be looking at the New Testament more exclusively. Certainly the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, is by far more my field of expertise, but I hardly really thought it would be extremely relevant for a room of predominantly Christians to listen to Old Testament textual criticism. So I'll be focusing on the Qur'an and the New Testament, and perhaps during the rebuttal period I might head to referencing some of the Old Testament a little bit. So what do we say about the Qur'an? Well, essentially, we say that it was a book revealed to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, roughly about 1400 years ago. I'll just get the summary up for you. Over a period of 23 years in Mecca and Medina, which are towns or now cities in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It certainly wasn't Saudi Arabia back then, and was basically just a land of varying tribal groups. There was certainly no single political or cultural identity other than really the speaking of Arabic and some, fundamental cultural norms that were sort of followed amongst the tribes. So we also believe that the Qur'an was revealed in what's called 7 ahruf. Okay, the singular of that word, harf, essentially means words or particles. Okay, now it might be a bit difficult to sort of get your head around coming from, I guess, an English New Testament sort of perspective, knowing that all of the New Testament basically comes in one language, in Greek. And indeed, we're saying that the Qur'an was only revealed in Arabic, but at the time, because of the differences between the tribes, there were a few dialectual differences. And we believe that the Qur'an was revealed in all of those different dialects. Okay? In terms of the exact nature of the difference, we don't really speculate. We now know, or we believe, that the Qur'an we have now is united onto one harf, or one dialect, and that's what we're going to be focusing on from here on in. Certainly, as Samuel quoted, the Prophet, peace be upon him, instructed that the Qur'an be written down during his lifetime. Now, it wasn't written down on paper, it wasn't written down on a book, simply because paper didn't really exist at the time. There were things like vellum, writing on bone, that sort of stuff, but writing down on paper and certainly having a bound book was not really an option, particularly given the desert climate. Okay, as Samuel also summarised, we believe essentially that Abu Bakr, who was the first Caliph, or the first president after Muhammad, peace be upon him, then collected the Qur'an again. And we believe that the reason for this is because a range of reciters and those that had memorised the Qur'an were dying, not just due to old age, but also in battles and the conflicts that were going on in the early Muslim period. And so in order to ensure that the Qur'an could be sustained in what we consider to be tawattur, or a perfect manner, or a certain manner, Abu Bakr had to ensure that there were at least 2 witnesses for every Qur'anic verse. Okay? And that's certainly a Qur'anic injunction, that for any fact to be established, there must be 2 witnesses. So basically Abu Bakr was trying to follow the Qur'anic injunction of having 2 witnesses. Moving on, we believe that later on, Uthman, who was the second after Abu Bakr for the Islamic presidency, so to speak, also asked for the Qur'an to be united, but this time onto one dialect. Okay? And there were 2 reasons for that. One, because Islam had spread beyond the Arab lands, there were non-Arabs that were combining dialects, different dialects, in reciting. And this, first of all, had the potential to change the meaning. But secondly, as the Arabic written language was starting to develop, people were spelling words differently. Okay, they were spelling words differently. And so because of that, it was important that the text was united onto not only one dialect, but also one mode of spelling. And so we'll move on from there. What do the academics say about the Qur'an? Well, very quickly, there's only a few options available for them to sort of stick to. The first one is that our account is more or less correct. Obviously, the non-Muslim academics aren't going to agree that the Qur'an has a divine origin coming from God, but they may say that our account is more or less correct, but it just comes from Muhammad or some other Arab at the time. Okay? The other option is that our tradition isn't exactly correct and that there were later additions, say 100 years or so after the death of Muhammad. Another option is that the Qur'an didn't exist in its current form until about 300 or 400 years after Muhammad. And then the final option is that the Qur'an was actually written in Syriac. Now, the last two options, I've underlined them because they've recently been disproven absolutely. So, as an individual in the audience, you can prescribe to one of the first two options, basically. Otherwise, you're going to be flying in the face of non-Muslim academics. And what is the academic evidence? Well, first of all, I'll say that there is strong academic evidence to support what we say. Okay? And essentially, most non-Muslim scholars will agree that our account is more or less correct. And I've just put up a disclaimer there so you know that I'm not trying to lead you in the wrong direction. Obviously, they don't accept that it's divine. Okay? But in terms of what we say, it was collected at the time of Muhammad, it was collected again at the time of Abu Bakr, it was collected again at the time of Uthman, they'll agree with that. In terms of our overall claim that the text hasn't changed during that period, they essentially agree with that. And I'll be giving you some quotes in just one moment. One of the major supporting arguments for this idea, and this is why the two latter arguments have recently been blown out of the water, is that the Islamic political climate was so tumultuous in the early period of Islam, after the death of the Prophet, that it is impossible for the text to have been altered and not contain at least some details about that. Okay, so for example, favouring one tribe over another, because the tribes were at a significant amount of war immediately after the death of the Prophet, vying for the Islamic presidency. And it was a conflict that went on for hundreds of years, basically, and didn't end until the Mongols came and conquered the Islamic Empire. So you can probably appreciate that if the Qur'an was fluid during this period, there would be some, political leanings introduced during that time, and there are none. Moreover, the manuscripts are essentially uniform. Okay, and what I mean by essentially uniform is that as far as the foundation goes, they are uniform. Okay, for those of you that don't know, Semitic languages, so Hebrew and Arabic are included in Semitic languages, have no written short vowels. Okay, they're later introductions to make recitation easier for non-native speakers. So the examples that we looked at with Samuel a little bit earlier are actually differences in short vowels that are far, far later introductions to the text and to the writing system. Right, in terms of the foundation of the text, the root words, there are no differences in any manuscript. And anywhere where there are manuscript differences, and I'll talk about one, they're corrected in antiquity. And in terms of the recitation differences, I'll probably be able to speak about that more in the rebuttal. So just very quickly, a couple of quotes from academics here. Wensborough's hypothesis of a very late crystallisation of the Qur'an text outside of Arabia is not in accord with the internal evidence of the text itself, which implies a very early crystallisation, i.e. before those civil wars I was just referring to. Okay, now that's from Fred Donner in 2006. The reference is there if you'd like to jot it down and check it for yourself. He's not a Muslim. Okay, this is what he's concluded about the Qur'an. He's a professor of Oriental and Semitic Studies at a university in the United States, I think Pittsburgh. Andrew Rippon has also said, in 1972, a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts of the Qur'an were discovered in Sana'a. Certainly the existence of the manuscripts indicates that the text, or at least extensive parts of it, were well in existence by the 8th century. So that means by 700, so roughly 50 years after the death of Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Qur'an was certainly in existence. Okay, again, a non-Muslim scholar. And the reference is there. What about the differences between the Hafs and Warsh recitation? Well, I'll just speak about them quickly. Both are verbal transmissions of the text, okay? Now, this again might be a bit hard for you to understand in a Christian context, but for those of you that do know at least Hebrew, you'll know that there's at least 3 different recitation methods in Hebrew for reading the Hebrew scriptures, okay? That's basically what we're talking about here with the Qur'an. It doesn't change the root text. It's just changing the recitation method. It doesn't change the meaning. It just changes the recitation method. And I'll actually look at a couple of examples, but first of all, quoting Adrian Brockett, certain differences between the 2 transmissions, so he's speaking about Hafs and Warsh, and again the reference is there, at least in the copies consulted, occur consistently throughout. None of them has any effect on the meaning. And what does that mean? All this points to a remarkably unitary transmission in both oral form and written form. Okay, so basically here's another non-Muslim scholar concluding that our version of events is more or less correct. So let's look at some of these differences. Now, for those who are at the back, this might be a little bit hard, and I've put the English transliteration there for you. These are actually differences between the Hafs recitation and the Warsh recitation that are quoted on a website that I know Samuel's contributed to called Answering Muslims. And here there's a couple of differences. Now, you can see that, well, from the way we look at it, that there are consonantal differences, differences in consonants. And you're probably thinking, well, hang on, he just told me that there's only short vowel differences. Well, I'm not going to speak about the short vowel differences. I want to give you some consonant differences so you know that I'm really not trying to pull your leg. The thing that I really want to hammer home is, first of all, for those of you, I hope everyone can see it, the dots above and below the Arabic letters do not exist in the original Arabic written form. Okay, so when the Qur'an was first written down, these dots above and below the Arabic letters did not exist. Now, these dots aren't short vowels, they're consonant markers. Okay, consonant markers. So, for those of you that don't know, Arabic's read right to left. So, in the first 2 boxes we've got over here, you'll see that the first word begins as a sort of a U shape with 2 dots at the bottom. That means ya, okay, or a Y, okay? On the corresponding word in the different recitation method, it begins with 2 dots at the top of that U shape. That means ta. Okay, now you think, well, hang on, that's a different consonant. Surely that changes the meaning of the word. It doesn't, because the root of this word here is about to speak. Okay, it just changes the tense of the word. It doesn't change the meaning of the overall sentence. Okay, going down, we've got another consonantal difference. Okay, again you can see with dots, the consonantal difference is regarding the 4th letter. Okay, it sort of looks like an upside down R. All right. In that instance, it actually does correspond to an R. Right, in the second one over, with the dot at the top of it, it means a Z. Okay? So we've got, in using the Latin transliteration, the words nunshizuha and nunshiruha. Okay, now these words actually have different specific meanings individually. One says to cover, or one means to cover, one means to propagate. Okay? But in the sentence in the Qur'an, it's referring to covering the bones of an animal with flesh. Okay, so one's saying cover the bones with flesh, the other one's saying put flesh all over the bones. Okay, so hopefully you can at least get a bit of a rough idea that these differences in meaning in the individual words don't change the sentence itself, and it kind of indicates that given that these dots didn't exist in the first sort of century or so of the Qur'an, that somehow the meaning was maintained without even the consonants being specifically maintained. So going on. The key issue here, but, is, as I said, there's no difference in the root of the text. Now we call that the rasm, the root of the text. Okay, so that's all these Arabic words without the dots. Okay, and without the short vowels. There's no difference there. So I'm sure that you can at least appreciate that graphically, from up the back even, the words in the 2 boxes there that correspond to one another look very similar. That's all that you really need to appreciate from that. So, was the Qur'an ever written like this without dots? Well, certainly it was. Here up on the left-hand side, I've got a very early manuscript, and again, this is going to be very hard for the people up the back to see, so many apologies, with no dots. Okay, no dots for the consonants, and no short vowel markers. And these additions to Arabic came over time. So here we've got a later manuscript. It comes about 100 years or so later, and again, it's going to be very difficult for you to see up the back, but there are red dots starting to appear resembling, meaning short vowels, and black dots for consonants. Okay? Now, this isn't the modern method that's used for writing. Okay, but that's not the issue that we're discussing here. We want to discuss whether the foundation of the text has been maintained, and certainly the manuscript evidence is that it has. Now, if you'd like to look at some manuscripts yourself, again, I'll have references up towards the end, and you'll be able to then take a look on the internet. One myth that's often propagated is that we don't allow Quranic manuscripts. Well, in fact, the United Nations has a website with thousands of old Quranic manuscripts that anybody can look at freely. I encourage you all to take a look. So there's the references there. I'll just leave that up for one quick moment, and if you don't get to write it down, there'll be time afterwards. So what do we say about the New Testament? And I've started there with a quote from the Apostle Paul about wisdom of the world being foolishness for God. We certainly believe that Jesus, peace be upon him, received a revelation somewhat similar to Moses and Muhammad. In terms of the specifics of that revelation, we don't know. Okay, we don't know. We certainly don't believe that the gospel accounts are reflective of that revelation in toto. And even the nature of the gospel accounts are not reflective of the revelation. The gospel accounts are, Mark's version of events, Matthew's version of events, Luke's version of events. We believe that Jesus was given a revelation, say, similar to the Torah, similar to the Pentateuch. Okay? We also believe that that exact revelation was then subject to distortion, okay, over time. And we don't mean necessarily over a period of 1,000 years. In a very short space of time, distortion can set in, and we're going to speak about that. Some argue that the Qur'an suggests that the New Testament at the time of Muhammad was not distorted, but there were no Arabic Christian scriptures until about 300 years or so after the death of Muhammad. Okay, so I'm not really sure how that argument kind of holds water. Ultimately, we believe, as I said, that the text in its current form is not reliable in total, but that it does contain some elements of what was there before. So why would this matter to us? Well, it may surprise the Christians, but it's very important to us because of what the New Testament suggests. Okay, the New Testament suggests that Jesus is God. The New Testament suggests that Jesus can save us from sin through his crucifixion. The New Testament suggests that we don't need to follow any ritual laws. Now, if the New Testament is telling the truth, then we really want to know about it. I think I speak for all Muslims in the room when I say it would make our lives a whole lot easier day to day. At least give me 25 minutes of the day. So it's very important that we assess the reliability of the text, okay? Because it's not just the message that we're concerned with, all right? I want to know, is the message being conveyed in a reliable manner, all right? And if it's not, well, then obviously I've got no interest in the message. And if it is, well, then I need to consider it. So in the same way that we look at the Qur'an, and remember I said we grade the Qur'an as being certain, and we don't grade a hadith necessarily on the same level, but how we grade the Qur'an as being certain is essentially through this sort of method, and it's basically a modern textual critics method. First we look at manuscript age, or in terms of the early history of the Qur'an, we're looking at the authenticity of the reciters that came and claimed to have verses. Okay? We look at the multiplicity of the manuscript. In terms of the early history of the Qur'an, we looked at how many reciters knew specific verses. We also look at the quality and assess for any potential bias. Okay? So again, for example, with regard to the Qur'an, if there's a verse that's been propagated that's essentially, say, Shia in theology, well, then we'll know about it. Okay, all these factors help us to assess the reliability of a text. So what are the facts? Well, certainly we agree that the Gospels are today the most historically reliable documents in terms of accounting Jesus' life. We know that there's roughly 6,000 Greek manuscripts. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. No two pages are identical. Now, again, I've got an honesty disclaimer there. By identical, there are some that only have a couple of spelling differences, 1 or 2 letters. But there are some pretty big differences that we're going to speak about as we go on. For example, verses that aren't in the oldest and best Greek manuscripts. And also, we're going to assess the issue that the earliest synoptic gospel documents that we have today appear 100 years or later than when they would have initially been written. So knowing those two facts, how is it not at least possible that the originals could have been distorted? So the earliest New Testament document is a portion of the Gospel according to John, and I've got it actually up here and down here for you to see. That's about as big as a credit card in real life, okay? It's written on both sides. It contains a few words of chapter 18 of John, and that corresponds to basically all other manuscripts and the modern version that you have in your hand today, okay? And it certainly shows us that that portion of John, at least, has existed for a long time. But what does it tell us about the rest of the book? Absolutely nothing. Okay? Because the original was written at least 50 years or so before. Let's consider all the Gospels. Well, Matthew, in terms of traditional accounts, would have been written around 50 to 80 CE, or the first Christian century. And the earliest manuscript we've got is dated to around about 180 CE. So we've got a gap of almost 150 years, taking it out to the maximum length. Are there variants? Yes, there are. Verse 44 of chapter 21 doesn't exist in that manuscript. Just go straight from 43 to 45. Okay? Mark and Luke, again, there's discrepancies of greater than 100 years between the earliest evidence that we've got of these Gospels existing and when they would have actually been written. Mark's actually almost 200 years. And as I said, John is only around about 50. Now, what are two quick facts that we can ascertain from this? First of all, 3/4 of the Gospel accounts have no evidence of existing within 100 years of them actually being written, the time that they should have been written. And even in the ones that we do have the earliest evidence, there are small variants and some significant variants. An entire verse missing from a manuscript that's only got about 5 verses. That's pretty significant. Right, so what does this mean? Can we be certain about the originals? Well, I don't think so. As a Muslim, I'll say now, I don't think so. If I did, I'd be a Christian. Okay? Because looking at even these simple facts, what did the Word of God originally say? How can I be certain that the crucifixion actually happened? How can I be certain that everything that is detailed in the Gospels is actually real? Well, I don't think I can. Let's consider some of the big sections. Now, I've just picked the ones that even modern-day Christians agree upon. First of all, the chapter ending of the ending of the Gospel according to Mark. There's 3 different endings. Nobody knows which ending is the real one. Okay, there's different assumptions made, but no one knows which ending is the real one. This is an entire ending of a Gospel. Okay? Next, the story of the adulteress in the Gospel according to John. It doesn't exist in the earliest manuscripts. In fact, it doesn't exist for almost 1,000 years after the Gospel of John would have been written. You know, why is it still there? There will be, little marks in modern-day Christian Bibles saying these don't exist in the earliest manuscripts. But why is this stuff still there? Okay, the John comma speaking about the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's not supposed to be there. It's not in the earliest manuscripts. So, yes, it's great that there are some things that haven't changed. But these things quite obviously have changed. What does that tell us about the rest of it? So if this were the case, well, there'd be hints that the text had been distorted somewhat. So, the text wouldn't agree with itself. So we start off with the Gospel according to Mark, and it says it is written in Isaiah the prophet, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. Well, no, that's from Exodus. That's not from Isaiah. Books that are separated by about 1,000 years. Fair enough, the next verse is from Isaiah, but that one's not. Okay? Another hint is when the fundamental concepts are ambiguous, and I'll come back to this point just because I'm noticing the time. Okay, but wait, there's more. A set of steak knives as well. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus says, I will never drink of this fruit of the vine until the day I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Okay, at the Passover meal. Only a chapter later, when Jesus is on the cross, he's served wine mixed with gall. So did he forget that was going to happen? Did he not know? What about in the Gospel according to Mark? It's not wine mixed with gall, it's wine mixed with myrrh. Okay, myrrh, for those of you that don't know, is a sweet-smelling perfume. Okay, gall smells disgusting. Gall's poisonous. Myrrh is something that for centuries, well, thousands of years, has been added to Middle Eastern and Oriental food in small amounts to add flavour. Completely different articles. So which one's true? They can't both be true. What are we relying on? Are we relying on scribes? Well, no, because we know that they made mistakes. As I said to you, there's no 2 pages of the 6,000 Greek manuscripts that exist that are identical. So we know that they at least made minor mistakes. What about early church fathers? Well, did the early church fathers even know everything that was in the Gospels? Let's consider a quote from Origen when he's refuting an early pagan critic of Christianity, Celsus. Origen says, in none of the Gospels current in the churches is Jesus described as a carpenter, because one of Celsus's criticisms was that, God would never be a lowly carpenter. Okay, we know now that in the Gospel of Mark it says, isn't this Jesus a carpenter, son of Mary, chapter 6, verse 3. So did he forget about that? Did he not want to quote it because it didn't really suit his apologetics at the time? Or did he not know about it? There's only 3 options. Translators, well maybe. Well, what about if Moses has horns? Anyone that's seen the statue of Moses by Michelangelo will know that translators make pretty big mistakes. You know, Moses obviously did not have horns. What about Paul? Well, Paul says in the letter to the Galatians, "Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all." However, in Acts 16:3, he circumcises Timothy, who was a Greek, so that he can minister to the Jews. Okay? Later, in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul explains that he's a Jew to the Jew, a non-believer to the non-believers, weak to the weak. Basically, he assumes whatever identity he needs to assume in order to propagate the gospel. Now, would any truth coming from God need to be propagated in such a manner? I don't think so. Is this the method of a holy God? I don't think so. Yes, the Lord may work in mysterious ways, but I don't think he lies to us. Okay? Closing up, is anything I've said here really that new? No. Early pagan critics of Christianity, and this is in the second Christian century, criticised the same things that I'm speaking to you about now. First of all, it's saying that the Christians themselves have corrupted the gospel from their original integrity to threefold, fourfold and manyfold times. Okay? This is a quote from, again, the same pagan, Celsus. I'll just take time for my rebuttal if that's all right. This is a quote from another early pagan critic of Christianity, and I've got the whole quote up there, but I'm just going to read out the parts that are important. "The evangelists were inventors, not historians, of the events concerning Jesus. For each one of them wrote an account of the passion which was not harmonious, but as contradictory as could be." And it quotes some differences. "From this out-of-date and contradictory record, one can receive it as a statement of the suffering, not of one of many. Not the suffering of one, but the suffering of many." Okay, meaning that surely this isn't talking about one man that was crucified, it's speaking about 3 or 4. "It is plain to see that this is a discordant invention, and either view points to many who were crucified, or one who died hard and did not give a clear view of what his passion was." So either the message of Jesus wasn't clear, and that's why we have gospel discrepancies, or they're not true in the first place. Okay? And simply, obviously, it opens up the door to criticism for every other aspect of the gospel in the New Testament indeed. The quote for that and the reference for that is also there. And that's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and I'll try to answer these as quickly as I can. Abdullah pointed out that there were many different halves, or these different words of the Qur'an, but the references that I gave in Bukhari actually showed here that these are more than just different way that words can be said, but there's a whole lot of different extra words there. So there are real textual variants. The difference you've got to remember is that while with the New Testament we've got manuscripts we can look at, the earliest Qur'ans were all burnt. So there's actually no evidence to look at because of this wholesale burning and standardising. Now Christians haven't done that to their texts. As I pointed out, they weren't in one set of hands, and there's a big difference between having burnt all your early manuscripts and not having burnt them. Yes, we've got differences within ours, but we haven't burnt them to standardise one text, and I think that is significant to say. He also mentioned Andrew Rippon referring to the Sana manuscripts, and the Sana manuscripts are now becoming available, and there's a whole lot of differences in them. They actually follow, some of them, the order of Ibn Masud. And sometimes within the one Qur'an, it actually shows its development over time, in that the Qur'an will be written in an early script and then have other pages put in at a later script, actually developing that Qur'an. So there are some scholars who are saying that the Qur'an was actually showing development within the late 7th, early 8th century. He quoted the Adrian Brockett quote, but Adrian Brockett actually says something else in his articles where he refers to Surah 2, verse 184, and he says, I don't know the exact quote, but I'll find it. It's along the lines of, none of the differences have a major effect on meaning, apart from chapter 2, verse 184. That may have some wider effect. But certainly the differences that he mentioned do change it. If you make it a ta or a ya, it goes from being possibly a he to a we. It can move it around from being an active to a passive. So there are some verses where it will say the prophets killed, and the other will say the prophets were killed, which change the sentence and the meaning of the sentence around. With the example I gave, in one it's Muhammad speaking, in the other it's God. That's a difference. Changing these dots makes a massive difference. In fact, changing the dots has a huge effect for the oral tradition of the Qur'an, because normally we're told that the oral tradition of the Qur'an predates the text, and that what we have is this oral tradition that's come down safely to us. However, when you look at the differences between the different oral traditions of the 10 readers that I mentioned, the differences are almost exclusively to do with, not completely, but overwhelmingly, where the dots go. And so because it's the vagueness of the original Arabic script, which didn't actually spell the whole word. When Abdullah was saying, oh, you see how the structure is the same, you need to understand that word in Arabic is not fully spelt. You need to have the dots and dashes to fully spell out what it is. Now, because the different oral traditions vary at the exact point where the text is vague, it actually means that the text is the source of the oral traditions. And so the oral traditions we have today are actually the result of the text, and then they're secondary to the text, not primary to it. Moving on to the Gospels, he said it's the gospel. They accept the gospel given to Jesus and not according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Well, first of all, as I've shown, you've got the Qur'an according to Ibn Hafs, Ibn Warsh, and so you don't just get the Qur'an straight anyway. So there's a similarity there. But also, there's no historical evidence at all that Jesus actually gave the gospel this way. The gospel is what God did through Jesus. It's not just what Jesus recited and said to them, but it's what he did, because what he did was the fulfillment of the promises of the Old Testament. And this is actually one way that we can be certain. Abdullah was asking for how we can be certain. Well, we can be certain because there are parts in the Bible which have very clear prophecies about what the future will look like, how God will save his people. And Jesus fulfills those. And so I have no doubt when I read passages like Isaiah 53, which talk about God's suffering servant. I don't have that on a PowerPoint I can show you at the moment. But when I read those, I can see that what the gospel talks about is true. For instance, the doctrine of the Son of God, it's there in the law of Moses. Israel's called the Son of God. In the Psalm 8, humanity is called, the image of God is in Moses. The image of God is in the Psalms. The image of God is in Ezekiel. The image of God is in the book of Daniel. The image of God is in the Gospels and the letters. But the image of God, humanity being made in the image of God, is not in the Qur'an. The Qur'an doesn't have any understanding. It doesn't teach about circumcision. It doesn't even mention circumcision or God's covenant that he made with Abraham. So many of the main messages of the prophets just aren't even in the Qur'an. But they're in the New Testament and they come to its fulfillment. And it's this coherence that actually tells us that this was the correct Gospels, and this is the correct Gospel account. Now, he mentioned that historians, and he quoted some early critics there, saying that the Gospels are all just made up. That modern historians do not treat that or say that at all about the Gospels. If you just read mainstream secular historians, they actually consult the Bible. And because the New Testament is actually, the Gospels are full of information about Jesus went from here to there and he went downhill. He travelled about this far. Now, for historians, that is gold, because that is actually where you can test it, you can judge it, you can see does it match up. See, when the Qur'an talks about Jesus, it doesn't have any place. Jesus is just there. In fact, it even talks about Jesus' mother being Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron. And so the stories of the prophets in the Qur'an are just in this world of story. They're not linked into any time or space. However, historians take the New Testament very seriously. I'd refer you to John Dixon's books on that, where he explains that, and there's a great introduction. Now, he also mentioned that in Matthew 21:44 that there's not a verse in the oldest copies, and there's some sections in John's Gospel about a woman being caught in adultery, the end of Mark's Gospel also. Yes, and Christians are very open about that. But as I pointed out with some of these manuscripts here, so the one on the left, that ancient manuscript has 2 extra surahs in it. These are surahs 115 and 116. Now, Muslims could put those in their Qur'ans and just put a footnote saying, well, you know, these are in the old manuscripts. They're there. So there are whole surahs that aren't in the modern Qur'an. So there are textual variants that could be listed in the footnotes from amongst the manuscripts, from amongst the hadith, from amongst these extra surahs. They could be added in there, but when you're given a Qur'an, it's not given those. How am I going for time? So I've got 3 minutes. Let's see what else I can do. I think you made a reference at the beginning of Mark to Mark quoting Exodus and Isaiah. I think it's Malachi in Isaiah. I didn't have a chance to look it up. But what he does there is actually a common thing of combining two similar prophecies to show how they come to their fulfillment, and that just happens. That's part of the way that they communicate. You spoke about circumcision with Paul and that Paul was a liar. No, Paul wasn't using lie or deceit. He was saying that circumcision has now come to its fulfillment in Christ, and that what matters is that our hearts are circumcised through the removal of sin that Jesus Christ brings through his death on the cross. And it's the removal of that flesh, and so all Christians are circumcised. What Paul said was that circumcision is now a matter of freedom. He said you're free to be circumcised or not to be circumcised. It's a matter of your own cultural identity now. And so on some occasions he would do it, others he wouldn't. There's no problem there. There's no deceit at all. The final quote I'll go to is from Dr. Abdullah Zaid from Melbourne University. And he writes this. He says, I'll have to turn around for this. Since the authorised scriptures of the Jews and Christians remain very much today as they existed at the time of the prophet, it is difficult to argue that the Quranic references to Torah and Injil were only to the pure Torah and Injil that existed at the time of Moses and Jesus, respectively. If the texts have remained more or less as they were in the 7th century, the reverence the Quran has shown them at the time should be retained even today. Many interpreters of the Quran, from Tabari to Razi to Ibn Taymiyyah and even Khattab, appear to be inclined to share this view. The wholesale dismissive attitude held by many Muslims from the modern period towards the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity does not seem to have support in either the Quran or the modern tafsir, the figures of tafsir. And that's Abdullah Zaid. He heads the Islamic University work in Australia. I'll finish there. Thank you.
All right, thank you again, Samuel. You posted some very interesting points. I think one thing that is very important to emphasise to the non-Muslims here is that there's a very big difference between a hadith and the Qur'an. A massive difference. Okay, the Qur'an, we say, is clear, it's certain, we know that the Qur'an came from God. Okay, a hadith are completely separate altogether. Now, yes, Samuel has quoted from Sahih al-Bukhari, which is one of our more trusted collections of ahadith, and it's probably accepted by about 99% of all Sunni Muslims. However, it's important to understand that there's different classifications of ahadith. Okay? And one classification, which fits in all the ones that Samuel quoted, is ahad. What that means is one, okay, singular. It's narrated by one person or through one chain of narrators. Now, that isn't considered enough for a Muslim to be certain for belief. Okay? So when we're quoting from ahadith that are referring to how the Qur'an developed and how it was collected, etc., if these ahadith, which all of these ones were, are ahad, or narrated only by one person through one chain, it's not something that we certainly believe. And all Muslims will agree with you. Now, and what I'm saying right now. Now, it's very important also to understand that there are differences of opinion as to what classifies a reliable hadith or hadith or saying and what doesn't. Okay? And Muslims have written thousands and thousands of books on these. Hundreds were already written by about the 3rd Islamic century, and classifying the different sayings into different categories. And I'm certainly not a scholar of that science, but it's important that you as an individual go away and sort of look at those, because don't think that we just take them on face value. We have explanations, and we also then have explanations of the explanations and disagreements between scholars, etc. Whereas with the Qur'an, everybody agrees that this is what the Qur'an says. Now remember, the structure, as I said, the structure is the same. Now if Samuel's going to say that, well, it's not just the structure that's important, it's also those dots and those small vowels, well then where does that leave the Old Testament? Now the oldest version of the Old Testament that everybody's got is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in Classical Hebrew. As I said, Classical Hebrew, being a Semitic language, does not distinguish between some consonants that are similar in Arabic, and it doesn't have short vowels. So can you understand the Old Testament? Likewise, to say that it's impossible to understand the Qur'an without these markers is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Because these markers in the Arabic language didn't exist until about the 2nd or 3rd Islamic century. Okay? Muslims were already writing commentaries on the Qur'an before they existed. So did they not know what the Qur'an meant? It's ridiculous. Having said that, I am very pleased with the hadith that Samuel quoted, because they all do refer to essentially what I was saying, that the rasam, or the foundation of the text, has not changed. Now there are some issues there that are probably open for interpretation. I'll actually quote one for all of you here today. Okay? There's two ahadith in the collection of Imam Malik, one of the earliest ahadith collections, where it's narrated that two different wives of the Prophet, one being Aisha and one being Hafsa, said that in a verse that's currently contained in the Qur'an, and in the middle prayer, they added the words, the Asr prayer. Okay, we have 5 prayers every day, and each one has a different title, depending on the time of the day. One is the Asr prayer. Okay, now these two ahadith have been known for centuries, from the very beginning of when they were recorded, roughly about 100 years after the death of the Prophet, as being explanations of the Qur'an. Because people read that verse, and guard the middle prayer. And they wanted to know, well, which one's the middle prayer? We've got 5, which one? Okay, and so people were explaining that. And most of what you see in the manuscripts that Samuel put up, the additions are explanations of the Qur'an. Okay, just like would be written in Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, explanations, not the text, explanations. Okay, you can't miss the differentiation between the two. Again, Samuel quoted some differences between Hafs and Warsh, albeit not super specifically. In fact, didn't really give any clear examples and didn't quote a specific example of Adrian Brockett other than just the surah number, and also didn't quote a scholar, whether it be Muslim or non-Muslim, that agrees with his understanding of how the Qur'an was collected. And as I said, there are differences in the mode of recitation. Now, as I said, the Old Testament has at the very least 3 modes of recitation: the Ashkenazi recitation, the Sephardi recitation, and the Yemeni or the Tamimi recitation. These are all completely different. Okay, the meaning of the words is the same, all right, but the way that it sounds is completely different. And someone that only understands Ashkenazi Hebrew, say being me, will have very great difficulty understanding Yemeni Hebrew, particularly when it's being read, the Old Testament. It makes very little sense to me. Okay, so recitation differences don't change the meaning of the text, and to suggest that is to put your own text at ransom. Now, yes, the Apostle Paul does say in one instance where you can choose circumcision or not. I can't remember what epistle that's in, but he's quoted quite clearly, or it's illustrated quite clearly in Acts, that Paul circumcised Timothy because Timothy's father was a Greek and he would not be accepted by the Jews. What does that mean? When Paul said, if you become circumcised, you are cut off from Christ. Okay, that's accepting the old law. And if you're under the old law, you're not under this. What does that mean? Now, Samuel was also up here speaking about coherence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, that's not coherent. Abraham said, it was said to Abraham quite clearly, your children will be circumcised. Jesus himself was circumcised. Why is it changing in the New Testament? You may have a theological reason for that, and that's open for you. But it also says, other things in the Old Testament, like God is not a man that he should change his mind. And that doesn't leave the door open for him to be a God-man either. That's just an exercise in semantics. It also says quite clearly that, yes, it certainly says in the Hebrew that God created humanity in his image. And it says quite clearly in the Qur'an that God breathed his spirit into Adam, and also into Jesus as well, for Jesus to be created. Okay? This is essentially what it's referring to, and I'd argue that from a theological standpoint, and this isn't really for me to do tonight, but from a theological standpoint, there's very little difference, unless you want to say God has hands and feet like us. There's very little difference between what we say and what you understand, because for us, the very Spirit of God that we all have in us to some degree is that image. Okay, it's what differentiates us from the dogs and the cats outside, if that makes sense. Now, I've also spoken very briefly about the canon of the Old Testament. I'll just let Samuel know, perhaps he doesn't, that there was a Sanhedrin, or a Jewish council in the first Christian century that determined what the Hebrew canon would be. That was defined reasonably early on. The Christian canon, however, wasn't collected until about 350. And even then it was fluid for a long time afterwards. Okay, so some of our earliest and best complete New Testament manuscripts have books that some of you have probably not even heard of, like the Shepherd of Hermas. Okay? I'd be very interested to see how many Christians here have actually read that. That was considered canon for about 1,000 years, and then considered not to be canon. Okay? Martin Luther himself said that Revelation should not be considered part of the canon. Martin Luther. Okay, now obviously you being majority Anglicans, I assume here, or at least majority Protestants, will respect him to some degree. He said that Revelation is not part of the canon. In fact, John Calvin also did not write a commentary on Revelation. It was the only book he didn't write a commentary on. So really, Christian, what are you talking about in terms of canon? Now, as I said, our story is that the Qur'an was well and truly canonized before the time of Uthman. And the Sana'ah manuscripts give the evidence of that. So far, there's been not a single scholar that said there are differences, like Samuel said, in the Sana'ah manuscripts, and I genuinely look forward to any individual that proposes that. They are available on the UN website, as I said, and I'll be more than happy to give that website to anybody later on this evening. Thank you very much.
So we're going to stand here, and he's going to ask questions of me and ask me to clarify or challenge me on something.
Okay. Yeah, so you said that, and you showed us an example of the Samarkand Codex, which is a reasonably early Quranic manuscript, and you also put up a modern-day example of the Qur'an showing chapters 112 to 114. And on the Samarkand Codex, you said that it does show 112 and 114 and an extra 2. Can you give me a brief rundown of what the extra 2 say, if you're aware? And can you quote for me even one scholar that suggested that these 2 are actually chapters of the Qur'an, were considered even by a fringe group to be a chapter of the Qur'an, and when they disappeared? Because the Samarkand Codex obviously comes well after the Uthmanic recension.
Yep. Okay, now I never said that the Samarkand had those 2 extra surahs. The Samarkand manuscript is incomplete. It only has about a third. The differences between it and the modern Quran are available online, and so you can search that. It's on the Answering Islam website. Now, can I give evidence that it was taken by any fringe group? Well, it was. I think it's called the Ban Kippur manuscript is the other one, which has surahs 115 and 16. Obviously, there was some Islamic group that had them because they had them in their Quran. Whether or not they line up with the hadith in Bukhari about Ubay, I've forgotten his first name, but Ubay, it talks about him having 2 extra surahs in his Quran. And so he had a 116 surah Quran. Now, whether or not they correspond to that early one mentioned in Bukhari, I don't know. And the one also, because that's the same as Al-Nadim also mentions that in the 4th Islamic century when he's looking at the Qurans, and they've got different numbers in them. Now, I want to point you to those sources. I'm not familiar at reading their content, but obviously someone believed in it because they had them, and they're certainly mentioned in Bukhari and in other sources.
All right. I mean, in terms of the extras added by Ubay ibn Ka'b, we can probably speak about that in the discussion perhaps after the event. It'll take up a bit too much time here now. But I guess if if I were willing to entertain the idea that these additions were accepted by a fringe group, well then, if that's making then a reflection on the Qur'an as a collection, well then what do the Christian fringe groups' opinions on the codex the canon of the New Testament have on reflect upon the collection of the New Testament itself? So, for example, we've got Marcion, who you quoted, who didn't believe in the Jewish God. He clearly distinguished between the Jewish God and the God of Christ. He didn't believe in any of the Hebrew scriptures. We've got others as well that believe in all the Gnostic Gospels. So, if we're going to consider the opinions of fringe groups, if they indeed do exist, as being relevant, well then how does that also cross-apply to the Christian experience?
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, and that was my point. I guess what I've been trying to call for in this debate is for us not to exaggerate either way. What I'm saying is that Christians, yes, we have had questions about what the canon is, and there were a number of books where we had to do the investigation and come to a decision. But what I'm saying is that there were similar discussions with the Quran, and there just were. There were some Qurans had 110, some had 116. They had to work it out. Now, I'm trusting that the Muslims worked it out to their satisfaction, and I'm convinced that the Christians worked it out to their satisfaction as well. I'm just asking that we don't exaggerate either way.
All right. Another thing that you said was that the consonantal markers and the short vowels don't matter. Now, how do you feel about the cross example I gave in terms of classical Hebrew not having consonantal markers for the fa and the pa and the kha and the ka? And also not having short vowels until, the Masoretic recension 1,000 years after Christ. I mean, how does that correlate to, a Christian understanding of even the Old Testament? Also, how does your opinion hold up to the fact that Muslims were commentating on the Qur'an at least 100 years before these vowel markers were introduced into Arabic.
Okay, heaps of questions. I'll just finish this question. Great question there. Let's hope I can remember it all. It's gone from my head. I fully accept that the Old Testament is similar as a Semitic language, and so has those uncertainties at points as well. So I accept that. And so that's why I'm calling for us not to exaggerate, but just to look at the evidence before us and not just say absolute perfection, complete corruption. So I accept that, and so we've got to do that. That being said, though, I don't think I said that the text couldn't be read. Certainly when you read those commentators, they would read it. But even when they read it, very often, like Tabari, in his commentaries, he will put forward where the dots could go and give a few different options. So even in his commentaries, it's not just you can read it obviously, he has to vocalise the text first. And so there are some readings that he accepts, other readings that he accepts. I mentioned the 10 different accepted readings that I put up before. There are actually a whole range of other ones which are rejected. And so not all readings are accepted. So there were people who had been reciting a particular reading which then was deemed not worthy and they couldn't use it. They had to use one of the 10. So I agree that it's there with the Hebrew as well. The Arabic text, yes, it's basic, but it still did need that process. I'm not saying that people couldn't do it, but when they did it, they had to put something there, and the early commentators chose to, when they did their work, had to establish the text first. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mainline historians would accept this. They'd accept it on grounds of multiple attestation, even from within the Bible itself, having the New Testament having between 5 to 7 different sources in it, testifying to it, to sources like Josephus, Tacitus, and there's a couple others, but I can't remember them, but about that many. And so they are saying that even very sceptical ones who don't accept God at all, that Jesus did die and that his disciples believed this about him. They don't believe it themselves, but they would say that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, in terms of Josephus, for those of you that don't know, Josephus Flavius was a Jewish historian. And in one of the versions of his history that have come down to us, I think the earliest, manuscript of it is, again, about 400 or 500 years after it would have been initially written. Josephus is reported to have written that Jesus, the Christ, was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Well, if Josephus believed that Jesus was the Christ, or the Messiah, for those of you that don't know, Christos corresponds to Mashiach, or Messiah in Hebrew, why did he remain a Jew his whole life? So, I'd question the validity of that source, and if then we can question that, well, we can certainly question Tacitus, etc. Tacitus, again, we haven't really got a very early example of any manuscripts of Tacitus or early versions, the history or the annals according to Tacitus. And if we are to sort of say, well, these details of history are in them and therefore they're definitely true, well, then we have to put the manuscripts themselves and also the individuals up to question. And I find it very hard to believe a Jew who remained a Jew would accept that Jesus was the Messiah. Jews for Jesus didn't exist in the 1st and 2nd century CE. In terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus, well, I guess, yeah, for sure, historians would claim, that overall that it's accepted that someone named Jesus, who was probably born in Nazareth, was killed on the cross under Pontius Pilate. Now, we essentially believe that. It says in the Qur'an that it appeared to them that he was crucified, so we believe that. We wouldn't dispute that it appeared that Jesus was crucified from a historical perspective. A very important point to note. The second point on that is that there are many, many historical errors that have been documented in the New Testament. So, for example, the marrying of King Herod Antipas with the census that was supposedly done by Augustus Caesar and the killing of the firstborns and all this sort of stuff, it doesn't quite marry up to even within 5 years of one another, yet the Gospel accounts consider that it all basically happened within 1 week, hence why Joseph travelled to Bethlehem, etc., for the census, and obviously why then the family fled to Egypt because Herod was killing all the newborns and all that sort of stuff. So, these are glaring historical errors in the Gospels. Now, I don't think that necessarily subtracts from the message that's contained within them, but I'm sure that you'll at least agree that they're glaring historical errors that all modern historians, even Christian historians, agree cannot be married up with reality.
Well, just on that point of history, I think you'll find that the Gospel account says that Herod killed all the children 2 years and under. And so there's a 2-year window. It's not 1 week. Now, where was I? I agree with what you're saying about Josephus, but historians take that into account. In other parts of Josephus, he talks about the death of James and just mentions the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. And so I don't think you can just write those sources off. And so it seems to me that you edit all history to fit the Qur'an. Would that be the case?
Look, that's certainly not the case. And I mean, I'm a student of history, particularly this period in time, particularly Jewish civilization history. Sorry, I'll just answer this question. I'll actually give you one more because my answers, sorry, are far too long. So, yeah, look, I mean, first of all, as I said, in terms of Josephus itself, Josephus was a Jew. I find it incredibly unlikely that Josephus would have considered Jesus to be the Christ and still remain a Jew. Therefore, any other reference to Jesus, James, his brother, the rest of his family, whatever happened, can be considered to be highly likely a later addition. Had Josephus had a moment on the road to Damascus and become a Christian, well, then I'd certainly entertain the idea. But otherwise, anything that he says about Jesus really can't be considered as, potentially historical fact. As for, the other issues that you spoke about, and the only one that immediately comes to mind is a little point that you snuck in there before about 2 years. Yeah, sorry, I should say 2 years, not a week. The point that I was making is that these 3 key events cannot be married within 5 years of one another. So whether it's separated by 2 years or a week really makes little difference unless these events were separated by 5 years, as they are in all other independent historical accounts. The fact that they're all contained within the life of Jesus, as per the gospel account, is highly unlikely. So look, as I said, as Muslims, obviously, we don't dispute that Jesus existed. If we did, we'd be disputing what we believe and what's in the Qur'an. We don't dispute that it appeared to the masses that he was crucified. So therefore, obviously, at least someone would have written down that it appeared that he was crucified. And in terms of whether I marry history to match the Qur'an, that's certainly not the case. I mean, I look at history for what it is, and if something contradicts with the Qur'an, I as an individual have a responsibility to deal with that, for my own faith. And in fact, the Qur'an says, in many examples, bring evidence if you're truthful. So, said allowing one more. So, yeah.
I just want to get to the death of Jesus again. In the Qur'an, you're saying that it says that Allah made it appear that Jesus was on the cross. Now, for the gospel, we believe that it's an eyewitness account of what God was doing in the world, the Spirit-inspired prophetic witness to what God has done in Christ. My question is, why would God deceive people like that? Why make it appear that Jesus was dying on the cross when he wasn't? Like, why give them a fiction and actually to, like you're saying, see, maybe Josephus and Tacitus and all that saw this fictional event that God had made. Why do that?
Well, I'm quite honestly not certain of the range of, exegesis or exegeses that are applied to this, verse or verses in the Qur'an. But, to make an assumption, which I really shouldn't do, but I'm only doing this for the benefit of the audience, to make an assumption, it was all about the fact that the enemies of Jesus, which, looking from a historical perspective, we can certainly say were the Romans and were the Sadducees, because pretty much everything Jesus says corresponds with what the Pharisees even believe today, and the rabbinic Jews, and certainly what Hillel the Elder spoke about 50 years before Jesus. Given that the Sadducees and the Romans were his enemies, and what was the punishment for someone claiming to be the Messiah? Death, from both the Romans and from the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were put in control by the Romans. That's, they were in control of the High Temple, they were in control of Judaism, put in place by the Romans. So obviously they were all about self-preservation. Now, if God had have, say, taken Jesus away to be hidden in a garden or something for a couple of weeks, would they have given up looking for him? No, they wouldn't have. So my brief assumption on that would be that it was purely to deceive the enemies of Jesus. And in fact, we've got examples in the Old Testament and also other examples in the Qur'an in the life of Muhammad, where enemies were deceived, through miraculous intervention by God in order to prevent them from pursuing, religious figures any further. So that would be my brief explanation.
Okay.
Thank you.